All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our Underground Railroad lecture series presented by Metro Parks and Friends of Fort Negley Park. So this presentation and the two following next week are in celebration of Fort Negley Park being added to the National Park Service Network to Freedom last year. In addition to that, September is also International Underground Railroad Month. Just a couple housekeeping items. Since all of our attendees are muted, you can add any questions you might have to the Q&A button. If you're on a desktop, it should be at the bottom of your screen in the middle. Just hit that Q&A button anytime throughout the presentation, and I'll collect those questions. We'll take as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So tonight's lecturer is Brigette Jones. Brigette Jones is a historian and graduated from Tennessee State University and University of Phoenix. She's in history and secondary education teaching, grades 7 through 12. Brigitte's worked at Belle Meade Plantation, both as a starting off as historical interpreter, as well as director of African American Studies. She worked at the State Museum for close to 2 years and is back at Belle Meade as director of Equitable Partnerships. And in addition to all that, she's also the founding manager of Bridge Builders Historical Consulting. I'll then pass it over to our lecturer, Brigette Jones.
Thank you so much. Hello, virtual world. For those of you who have not met me in person, again, my name is Brigette Jones, and I am the Director of Equitable Partnerships for the Belle Meade Historic Site and Winery these days. And I've had an interesting run thus far throughout the historic field. I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm very happy to expand upon what I've learned through continuously learning more and by making the people over at TSU who produce me very, very proud. So thank you all to the Friends of Fort Negley for having me this evening. So I will jump right into it because, as the old preachers say, I will not be before you long. So let me get into it. Right here. All right, so my presentation is entitled Chasing Destiny, an homage to them that said no. When this opportunity first came across my desk, I was like, oh my gosh, what can I talk about regarding the Civil War? What can I talk about with the USCT? And for those of you who don't know, war history is really not my forte. So I had to take a route that really spoke to me. And enslavement is something that I've spent a lot of time researching, a lot of time interpreting. So I really wanted to hone in not on just enslavement, but on runaways, because I don't think runaways get enough publicity in the story of enslavement. We focus heavily on treatment, which we all know is extremely important. But what about those of them who said, nah, can't be me? Let's give them people some shine this evening. So first up, before we can really discuss the act of self-emancipation, we must first express or explore the foundation and collateral damage done by the institution of slavery as it relates to the Black American experience and people. And as I was researching this, I found this thesis actually by Major L. Jones called Black Awareness, a Theology of Hope. And it says, over 300 years ago and many years thereafter, Black men and women and children were extracted from their native land of Africa deliberately by plan, stripped bare psychologically, physically, and religiously, and transplanted in an alien land dominated by the white man. Within this new context, the Black man was to occupy the most degraded of all human conditions, that of a slave, a mere piece of property, a nobody in the fullest sense of the word. The Black man by plan was broken up, scattered, and sold from auction block to auction block all over America. The Black male, for all practical purposes, was completely emasculated, and the Black female was systematically exploited and vilely degraded. And I thought that this was a really powerful quote to explain the foundation of slavery and what the institution of slavery goes on to do to Black individuals throughout time. So here you can see exactly why people were pursuing freedom, because this is the reality that they were dropped into upon their arrival in the new America. Now, what I should have done before I began is a land acknowledgement. I try to start every presentation with one. I like to acknowledge the fact that had it not been for the land of the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, and the Seneca tribes, none of us would be here to tell these stories today. So I wanted to take a moment to also throw that in there as well. Now that we have this understanding of the foundation of what enslavement did, we can now understand why they felt the need to actually leave. But everybody didn't leave in the same way. There's one way that doesn't get enough shine, and that's suicide. So for just a moment, I want to take a moment to pay tribute to the ultimate act of rebellion. On behalf of the ancestors, I would like to hold a moment of silence for those who chose death over bondage. Now I'm going to go through the slides here. Nothing of importance since our last issue. A Negro committed to jail as a runaway cut his throat on Monday evening, and a pair of horses attached to a wood wagon made a break on Tuesday. No damage done in the latter case except arousing the captain and first lieutenant of the loafers from their afternoon siesta. Think about the irony in this one article. Nothing of importance happened. A Negro committed to jail as a runaway cut his throat on Monday. The idea that that is nothing of importance is what really pulled me to this article. Moving to the right at the top, a Negro woman who was arrested a few nights ago by one of the town watch as a runaway hung herself in jail yesterday morning. Last but not least, a young girl named Louisa, a slave, committed suicide on Thursday by drowning herself in a pool water near the reservoir to this city. I don't think we talk about the fact that slavery was so horrible that people decided to literally kill themselves enough. We look at in the history of enslavement in these broad academic terms, and what I do is called ethical interpretation or realistic interpretation. I like to take historic documents and make them digestible for the average American. In a sense, this was just really messed up. The fact that you have an institution that existed for so long that people literally decided, I would rather die. That's going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the history of enslavement. And you can especially see that in the legacy of Negro spirituals. Just about every Negro spiritual that I have ever heard has a reoccurring theme of death being the ultimate freedom. I'm just trying to get to glory. The idea that you cannot achieve freedom in your living state, so you wish to die for it. That says a lot about the institution of slavery for naysayers who say that it was a paternalistic institution. Last but not least, I want to pay tribute to the descendants of the enslaved, the descendants of those who had a rebellious spirit, the descendants of those people who also said nah, whose descendants then said nah. I want to pay tribute to them for their no, for saying, I will not sit on the back of the bus. I will not sit in a separate classroom. I will sit at this lunch counter and you will not make me sit anywhere else. I thank them for their sacrifice, because had it not been for them saying, nah, I would not be here to tell these truths today. Now, in 2018, rapper Meek Mill dropped his fourth studio album entitled Championships. Now, this album is going to be a chronicle of after his release from prison. And he had a very highly publicized prison stay in court case. Now, his case opened the floor again for deeper discussions on modernized slavery and the new Jim Crow through an exploration of our prison system and our extremely flawed criminal justice system. Now, track 5 is featuring fellow hip hop moguls Rick Ross and Jay-Z, and they ask a centuries-old question on track 5. They say, what's free? Now, the actual verse says, free is when nobody has to tell you what to be. And I think that follows right along with what Oxford English Dictionary describes freedom as. 1, the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. 2, absence of subjugation to foreign domination or despotic government. Or 3, the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. So now that we have this very thorough explanation of what freedom actually is, and we see now why the enslaved were chasing freedom, we see what they were after, we see what they were going through, let's get into who was perpetuating this system. So I found this very interesting runaway ad. It says $65 reward, ran away from the corporation of Nashville. So when most people tend to think about enslavement and think about runaways, they tend to only block the Southern plantation system into one very narrow box. And that's the Gone with the Wind narrative. You know, the big, beautiful mansion with hundreds of slaves running around happily, looking like it's a great day. That's a part of slavery. That is one aspect of slavery. Most people don't even know that cities and states also owned enslaved people. And this man ran away from the corporation of Nashville on June 24th. Now, as you dig deeper into this, you get a little bit, you get a little bit of that feeling that most people think of. Here in the center here, as I was reading through my book, I saw this quote that says that I was sold 4 times in my life. First time by my half brother. He carried me away from Springfield when I was 7 years old. And when I had come to the age of 12, my half brother sold me. I was mighty near like Joseph. Now, again, the individuals perpetuating these institutions are not just people, they are also corporations. So when people begin running away, they're not just running away from people, they're also running away from entire cities and states. Slavery was an institution that permeated every piece of American society. There was no person that was left untouched, no institution that was left untouched. From the clothing industry to the insurance companies, everybody had a piece of slavery. So when an individual decided they were going to self-emancipate, they were rebelling against the United States government for quite some time. Now, to get a little bit deeper into those plantations that most people think about when they typically think about runaways, I want to introduce you to my place of employment. This is the Belle Meade, historically, the Belle Meade Stud Farm, later plantation. Today it is known as historic Belle Meade Winery. Now, there's more to the plantation than winery, of course. This is a 10,600 square foot house. At the peak of its existence, it sat on 5,400 acres of land. And the Harding and Jackson family owned 136 men, women, and children by 1860. That put them in the top 4.5% of slaveholders in the state of Tennessee by 1860. The Harding and Jackson family was definitely the upper echelon of the slaveocracy. So one can assume that they had their fair share of runaways. And I'm going to introduce you to a few of them. First up is Ben the Blacksmith. Now, if you ever had the chance to take my Journey to Jubilee tour, or if you've ever heard my presentation, Tennessee Slavery, Parallels, Perspectives, and Psychology, you've heard the story of Ben and Ned and Will, who I'm going to describe in just a moment. But I'm going to give you a moment to read the ad. I'll read it out loud for those of you who might not feel like reading. I totally understand that. This says $20 reward. Ran away from the subscriber living about 6 miles south of Nashville on Richland Creek. About the 6th of June last, a Negro man named Ben, about 40 or 45 years of age. Oh no, let's go back. About 40 or 45 years of age, about 5'9" high, and tolerably Black. A blacksmith by trade, his marks I do not so well recollect, but believe he has a small scar on his upper lip and 2 or 3 on his head, which he said was occasioned by the kick of a horse. And he has a remarkably short, nappy wool on his head, had on when he went away, a dark mixed homemade coat with linsey overalls, a toe shirt, wool hat, and a pair of very strong made Jefferson shoes with thick behind. I bought him on the fall of 1806 in the city of Richmond, state of Virginia, from Lewis Harvey. Well, I expect he will aim for or for the state of Ohio. The above reward will be paid by me if he is confined in any jail so that I can get him again, delivered to me, living on Richland Creek with reasonable charges. Now, there's a lot to unpack with this runaway ad. The first thing being that Ben is a blacksmith. If you do not know, blacksmiths were considered skilled laborers. A skilled laborer is your blacksmith, it's your stonemason, it's your carpenter. These types of enslaved individuals are typically going to make you more money, which means they typically cost you more money to purchase. Usually though, because of their skill set, they're in many cases, they're referred to as quasi-independent slaves, which means that they can live a life that is still slavery, but given a little bit more freedom than the rest of the enslaved population. Now, in Ben's case, Ben would have been working and more than likely living near the blacksmith shop, which sat about about a mile west of where Belle Meade sits today. Now, with that being said, if he's all the way down there full time, away from all of the Harding and Jackson family members, on what is today Harding Pike, historically part of the Natchez Trace, always been a busy road, there's a strong possibility that Ben could have met someone patronizing that blacksmith shop that could have given him the clues that he needed to make his escape. Now, in Ben's case, however, there's a lot of factors that go into this. What time of year do you leave? You can't read, so you got to know which direction you're going in. So you need assistance along this way. Now, what I will say is that Ben was never captured nor returned. So it's my hope that Ben was able to find his freedom somewhere above the Ohio River. But the fact still remains that in 1806, when Ben was purchased, Belle Meade was a very young farm. The enslaved individuals who assisted with the establishment of Belle Meade led a much different life than the enslaved individuals who lived throughout the 1850s and 60s. The farm had been established by that point. That means the enslaved of the early 1800s at Belle Meade had to clear all the land, cut down all the trees, build the slave quarters, build their house, and essentially build the rest of the farm as it began to grow over time. That's back-breaking labor. And clearly Ben said that he didn't want to do it, so he took his chances. Let's hope that Ben was able to find his freedom somewhere above the Ohio River. Now, the next person to leave Belle Meade was actually Ben's replacement. His replacement was named Ned. Now, Ned got to Belle Meade roughly 3 months after Ben left, and then he left 4 days later. That means that Ned got there and turned around and left the exact same day. And these same rules apply. For Ned, for Ben, being there in that early period means they had a much harder labor-centric work in that time period. I'm sure their conditions were much worse. John Harding, as a person, was a very stern person who felt very strongly about the place of Black people and enslavement. So I'm pretty sure that John Harding wasn't paternalistic in the way that we like to think slaveholders were in many cases. With that being said, Ned decided that he was going to leave here as soon as he got here, and that he did. From our research, Ned was never found either, so let's hope that Ned was also able to find his freedom above the Ohio River. But when Ned left, his charge was not just escape. At the top of this ad you see here, stop the thief. That made his punishment that much more damaging if he would have been captured. I'm sure that Ned nor Ben could read the newspaper, but I'm sure they knew the punishments for their crimes. They knew that when they left Belle Meade, they could not come back. Leaving a plantation and having to be returned to a plantation is probably the worst thing that you can do. Thankfully, they were not found. Hopefully, they each found their freedom. Last but not least from Belle Meade, I call this the challenging story of Will. This story is challenging because there's so many moving pieces to it, and I'll break the whole thing down. Now, Will was enslaved by William Giles Harding, second generation owner of the Belle Meade plantation. Now, here you can see that this is dated 1844, ran away from the subscriber living in the county of Davidson on the 15th of August last, a copper-colored man named Will. Said boy is about 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high, heavy beard, partly gray, head slightly gray, and about 45 or 50 years old. I will give the above reward if said Negro is taken without any, I don't know what that says, without any something of Davidson, and $10 if taken in the county, if taken without the county, and delivered to me or placed in a jail where I can get him. Now, there's a man that used to reside in Nashville. His name was James Thomas. James Thomas was also formerly enslaved here in Tennessee, but he was biracial. He was the son of a Supreme Court justice and a quasi-independent slave woman named Sally Thomas. Now, James became a barber here in Nashville. And in his book that he later wrote, From Tennessee Slave to St. Louis Entrepreneur, James Thomas details the story of William Giles Harding sitting inside of his barbershop with other elite slave-owning men of the time and talking about this enslaved man named Will who had escaped and went to Buffalo, New York. Now, if you're a history buff, you know that Buffalo, New York was a haven for freed Black people and fugitive slaves as well. And it was a haven because it was so close to Canada. And if you could get to Canada, you were kind of home free. They technically couldn't bring you back if you made it across the border. Well, in this barbershop this day, William Giles Harding says that he went to Buffalo, New York to find his fugitive slave, and he went in a Black barbershop to find this fugitive slave. Now, he's only telling James this story because that barber in Buffalo is also James's brother. Both men are biracial. Sally Thomas had 3 biracial sons by 3 white men in Nashville. This one was able to get free and move to Buffalo. Now he asked James, do you have a brother in Buffalo, New York? To which James tells him yes. He says, well, I went to Buffalo, New York to find my runaway. And I believe I went into your brother's barbershop. And I've never been met with such a cold and indifferent treatment before ever in my life. And, you know, I thought that was interesting because you are a wealthy white slaveholder in a free state in a Black barbershop asking the room full of free Black people, have y'all seen my runaway? Well, I bet they were quite cold and pretty indifferent. I cannot blame them. Nonetheless, he says that he was met with such cold and indifferent treatment that he left the barbershop altogether and decided he was going to come back to Nashville and leave that fugitive slave in Buffalo, New York. Now, he continues his story in this barbershop with James Thomas, and he says that before he could board his train to come back to Nashville, none other than runaway slave Will walks up to William Giles Harding and says, sir, I heard you was in town and I had to see you before you left. Okay, so let's look at this logically. By 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law is going to be passed. Now, things are stirring up before this. Black people are getting kidnapped left and right from states like New York and Massachusetts and being sold down south illegally. Logically speaking, why would a fugitive slave run up to his former master who he had run away from just because I heard you was in town and I wanted to say, hey? Didn't make any sense to me either. Didn't make any more sense to me when I finally found this runaway ad, because for quite some time, we just thought this was the story that William Giles Harding told. Now we know it's a story he told, but we know that story that he told is not completely true. So again, one of the most interesting things about interpreting the history of slavery is knowing how to decipher the sources. Because if Black people couldn't read and write, guess who's telling the stories and guess who's writing them? As far as I know, Will was able to stay in Buffalo, New York. Let's hope he was able to continue with his freedom. Next up is the Hermitage. Now, the Hermitage is over at its height. It was at over 1,000 acres, and it was owned by none other than former President Andrew Jackson, and he held more than 300 enslaved men, women, and children throughout his lifetime. Now, this house is absolutely beautiful. It still sits on over 1,000 acres. If you've never been, take the time out to go. This is our former president, Tennessee's own Andrew Jackson. He lived from 1767 to 1845, born March 15th in the colonial Carolinas, served as 7th United States president. His reputation grew following the Battle of New Orleans, and he signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. He is the reason we are doing these land acknowledgements today. Now, Andrew Jackson was a very interesting slave owner himself. He was a lot like John Harding of Belle, Meade, actually, very stern, definitely a man from the colonial period in his view of Black people's place in society, especially during the antebellum period. Now, he is going to issue a runaway slave act that I was able to find, which to this day tops the cake for me. I call this one the people's president because the enslaved were people. So what people was Andrew Jackson representing? This ad says $50 reward, eloped from the subscriber living near Nashville on the 25th of June last. A mulatto man slave about 30 years old, 5 feet an inch high, stout made with inactive, talks feeble, flops in his walk, and has, there's something here blocking my view, but it says it's broad across the top of his foot. Will try to pass for a free man. As I am informed, he is obtained by some means. Certificates as such, took with him a drab great coat, dark mixed body coat and ruffled shirt, cotton homespun shirt and overalls. He will make for Detroit through the states of Kentucky and Ohio or through the upper parts of Louisiana. The above reward will be given to any person that will take him and deliver him to or secure him in a jail so that I can get him. If taken out of the state, the above reward and all reasonable expenses paid. This is where it gets tricky for me. $50 reward and 10 extra dollars for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. That was posted in 1804. That ad is essentially saying that I will pay you $50 to get him. And if you are willing to beat him up to 300 times, I am willing to give you $10 extra for every 100 lashes. I want you to sit with that for a minute. I want you to feel it. Take it in. Think about the fear that has to exist within the enslaved when this is the type of punishment they know is common. And this institution was called paternalistic. We're going to get to that in just a moment. The Reverend J.W. Logan, as a slave and as a freeman, a narrative of a real life, was an autobiography written by this man, Reverend J.W. Logan, once he was able to escape and find his freedom. And we're going to tell you his whole story in just a moment. But this excerpt I found from his narrative says, the genealogy of an American slave may be traced with certainty to the mother, rarely to the father, never beyond them on the male line. It is the condition of the mother de facto that makes the slave. She is the mother de leg only to the intent that her offspring may be an outlaw. As to the progenitor on the male side, he is rarely known as the father, in fact, never in law. The slave has no father. Slave legislation has no other paternal line and refuses to acknowledge one. It acknowledges a mother, not in respect to any natural relation, but for accommodation, as the medium of titles, not of affections or obligations. Legally speaking, the slave has neither mother nor father. Now, with that being said, the status of the enslaved was, as you can see, inherited by the mother, and this dynamic bred as a result is explicitly detailed here. So when you think about the legacy of enslavement, the role that it played on Black families moving forward, the role that it played on American society moving forward, you have to go back and look at the laws that were common at the time, because these laws set forth a motion that America is still reeling from today and essentially trying to get out of. Now, Reverend Logan was actually enslaved right here in Tennessee. You can see his picture here. He was enslaved by the Logan family. He is mulatto. He was the son of his master. And his mother was actually born free in Ohio. His mother was kidnapped as a child and sold to Tennessee, right outside of Davidson County, where they will be enslaved for the remainder of their lives. His mother definitely for the remainder of hers. Now, after seeing years of abuse at the treatment of his enslaver's wife upon his mother, for obvious reasons, I'm assuming, he decided that he couldn't take it anymore. Him and 3 other enslaved men loaded up their horses and they fled. They fled to Canada. They got all the way out of the United States. Upon his arrival in Canada, he became an ordained minister and he wrote this book. Now, I'm going to read you guys a quote about what happened with this narrative. Because you see, when this narrative was written, just so happened that old slave owner of his had passed away, but his wife was still living. And his wife got a hold to this book. And she read it. And she said, she wrote him a letter. And she said that his mother, her name was Cherry, was still there, still a slave, and as well as common. However, Sarah also said that her family had fallen on hard times, in part because when the Reverend ran away, he stole a horse. So she's saying that you stealing this horse put our family in such debt that we can't get out of it. He says, and that they had to sell his brother and sister as a result. In the letter, she asked the former slave for $1,000 so that I would give up all claim I have to you, quote unquote. And he returned her letter. Of course, obviously from a very, very free place, but he said what I feel like every enslaved person for the most part thought in their hearts. He told that woman, you say you have offers to buy me, and that you shall sell me if I do not send you $1,000. And in the same breath, and almost in the same sentence, you say, you know, we raised you as we did our own children. Woman, did you raise your own children for the market? Did you raise them for the whipping post? Did you raise them to be drove off in a coffle in chains? I think this is very telling. Reverend Logwin here said explicitly what many fugitive slaves wish they would have been able to say to their former master. This trumps the idea of slaves being family. Even in that familial dynamic, they are considered to be lesser than, because that woman, though she may have raised him, did not raise him to be on the same level intellectually, socially, economically as her own birth son, solely based upon the color of his skin. So Reverend Logwin, he said, nah, and he got on down. Next up, 30 years a slave, from bondage to freedom. The institution of slavery is seen on the plantation and in the home of the planter. Now, this book was written by a man named Lewis Hughes. And Lewis Hughes was also biracial, enslaved right here in Tennessee in multiple places. He was enslaved in Memphis as well as Nashville. And he attempted to escape 3 different times. And I already told you that escaping and being returned is the worst of it all. In many cases, you've heard the horror stories of people getting their hand or foot cut off because they were attempting to run away, brandings with the letter R. All of these things are common, but he describes a beating that I cannot recount. I'm just going to have to let you see it for yourself. In that book, he says, he details the harshness of his new home. In the new home, my duties were harder than ever. The McGees held me with a tighter grip, and it was nothing but cruel abuse from morning till night. So I made up in my mind to try and run away to a free country. That was when he ran away the first time. The first time he was returned, he got a slap on the wrist. It wasn't a big deal. They let him walk away a clean man. But the second time, he quotes, about 3 months after my first attempt to get away, I thought I would try it again. Word was sent to boss of my capture. And the next morning, I was taken to the barn where stocks had been prepared, beside which there was a cowhide and a pail of salt water, all prepared for me. It was terrible, but there was no escape. I was fastened in the stocks, my clothing removed, and the whipping began. Boss whipped me a while, then sat down and read his paper, after which the whipping was resumed. This continued for 2 hours. Fastened as I was in the stocks, I could only stand and take the lash after lash, as long as he desired, the terrible rawhide cutting into my flesh at every stroke. Then he used peach tree switches, which cracked the flesh so the blood oozed out. After this came the paddle, 2.5 feet long and 3 inches wide. Salt and water was at once applied to wash the wounds, and the smarting was maddening. This torture was common among the Southern planters. God only knows what I suffered under it all, and he alone gave me strength to endure it. I could hardly move after the terrible ordeal was finished, and could scarcely bear my clothes to touch me at first. So sore was my whole body, and it was weeks before I was myself again. I like to include images of people when I do things like this, because I like you to put a face with the ordeal. Because sometimes looking at these individuals helps bring humanity to the story. Because you see, slaves were regarded as property, not people. Nobody cared how they felt, but look at this man. Lewis Hughes, a man who was treated as property, who took it upon himself to leave that state and try to make more of himself. How dare he aspire to freedom? How dare he think he be equal? How dare he? And because he dared, he was beaten. And this is one story of many. But just marinate on that. Last but not least, the war and Black soldiers. When I found this, I thought it was really interesting because I had to go and read up a little bit more about the USCT myself for this. And I found this very wonderful plaque done by the Tennessee Historical Commission. It says that from October to December 1862 on this hill, Black laborers helped the Union Army build Fort Negley. In November, Blacks helped defend the unfinished fort against Confederate attack during the Battle of Nashville. Nearly 13,000 Black soldiers aided in the defeat of the Confederates. By 1865, Blacks had assisted the Union Army in building 23 fortifications around Nashville. So a lot of times when we think about the Civil War, I know how it was taught to me in school was that it's white men versus white men. Northern white men who were good and peaceful and don't believe in slavery against the really bad Southern white men who want to keep all the Black people in chains. That is how that story has been told. That story is not completely accurate because it omits the role that Black men played in pursuing their own freedom, and Black women too. In many cases, these camps, these fortifications, Black women were cooking and washing clothes. Black men were building fences and sharpening tools and assisting in any way that they could. Black men entered this war and decided for the first time as a collective that we will be free. And they achieved that with the help of many good men and many indifferent men, and at the demise of a lot of men who hated them. You see, these men were able to become free through standing up for what they believed in and assisting an effort that they inadvertently had caused. They took up arms against the very individuals that tried everything that they could to keep them in bondage forever. Slavery was not supposed to end. I am not supposed to be talking to you today. But thank you to these men who decided that, nah, we can't do it no more. Last but not least is another Belle Meade story. This man is named James Harding. James Harding is the son of John Harding's nephew, biracial. James Harding is one of the men who went to build Fort Negley. Now, here at the bottom, you can see that he attempted to escape and he ran away to the fortification, and he stayed at Fort Negley for quite some time. He tells you exactly what he did, and he tells you that he was eventually sent to jail after leaving. Now, James Harding is one of the few men who was able to give a Tennessee narrative of his work during the fortifications of Fort Negley. And James Harding is the legacy of Belle Meade. James Harding is the legacy of many plantation museums right here in Middle Tennessee. James Harding is the legacy of enslavement. These two histories, Black history and Southern history, especially white, Black, and Southern history, they are so deeply intertwined. And until we get comfortable discussing and disseminating that intertwining, we're going to continue fighting the same battles year after year, day after day. So, to my ancestors, I say thank you for your sacrifice. And to my audience, I say thank you for listening. If you have questions, I am more than open to taking them. I am right on time. Thank you. Now I have here some suggested texts. These are some of the texts that I read to actually form this. So Mighty Rough Times, I tell you, is actually an excerpt. It's a book of the WPA slave narratives, as well as Ophelia Suttle's Egypt's narratives, what was done on behalf of Fisk University. I love them because they show the compare and contrast between the answers given by enslaved people who were interviewed by white people and the answers given by enslaved people who were interviewed by Black people. And James Thomas, who we talked about last, is also someone who was interviewed by these narratives. And he gives a very candid interview regarding his father, how he felt about his father, and his exploits with white women during that time. So if you've never checked that out, please take some time to check that out. Also, Runaways, Coffles, and Fancy Girls, A History of Slavery in Tennessee, top tier by Bill Carey. Probably my primary resource in developing this. Bill Carey is a historian focused on Tennessee history. And this book is wonderful research, wonderful work. Next up is Dr. Bobby L Lovett. As a TSU grad, Dr. Lovett is like the holy grail of all things Black history. So the African-American history of Nashville, Tennessee, 1780 to 1930. That is like the Bible for a Nashville Black historian. And then, of course, as I talked about earlier, from Tennessee slave to St. Louis entrepreneur, I think it's very important to champion first-person narratives because there's not as many of them as I would love for them to have, for us to have. So the few that we have, I think everyone needs to pay attention to those primary sources. You don't have to take my word for it, as LeVar Burton would say. You can go straight to the source and hear that. 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom. Read Lewis Hughes' narrative. You can actually download that one as a PDF to your computer. You don't even have to purchase it, as well as Reverend J.D. Logwin, as a slave and as a freedman, the narrative of a real life, also downloadable as a PDF. So I wanted to get stuff that you didn't really have to spend a lot of money on, and they're excellent resources. So again, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'm open.
All right, just to remind everybody, if you have a question, you can use that Q&A tab either at the bottom of your screen, bottom to the left-hand side, or you can also just put it in that chat box as well. We'll give some people a little time to put in some questions. I do have one myself. I didn't catch, how many people did you say were enslaved at Belle Meade at its height?
136.
136. And I think you profiled 3 that escaped. Was that is that all that we know that escaped from Belle Meade?
That's all that's been recorded. Outside of those that left during the war effort to assist with Fort Negley, those are the only ones that we know that self-emancipated.
Okay. What about severity of punishment for those left behind? Is there anything showing that Hardings got any more severe as people left?
We don't have anything from the second generation or the third. So William Giles Harding, we have no record of himself ever administering punishment. We do know that he gave the okay for a man who stole from, well, not even stole from Belle Meade, he had stolen goods at Belle Meade. He got 80 lashes, and William Giles Harding sanctioned that. We do have reason to believe that John Harding was probably a little bit harsher because those 2 runaways take place back to back under his leadership. So we use that to assume that John Harding must have been a little bit harsher than his son was, which was not uncommon for that time period.
All right. Dr. Williams asked, we're fortunate to have Dr. Williams as attending this presentation. Dr. Williams is our lecturer on September 16th. That's a week from Thursday, so be sure to come back for that. Dr. Williams' question is the tour you created, that Brigette created at Belle Meade, still in operation? And if so, when does it run?
Hey, Dr. Williams. Yes, it is. It runs 7 days a week, 10:30, 12:30, and 2:30. So yeah, feel free, come on by.
Wonderful. All right. Someone asked, how did slavery change in Nashville after the Civil War? Of course, we know slavery ends with the 13th Amendment right there at the end of the war, right after the end of the war, officially ends slavery, enslavement, except for the punishment of a crime. So perhaps another way to phrase that is, how did African-American life change in Nashville after the Civil War?
Oh man, drastically. For many African Americans living in Nashville still, they will continue to work for their former enslaver under either a contract or a wage system. In some more rural areas, you see some sharecropping, which is kind of a combination of both contract and wage systems. You have, for urban Black people who are living in the city, they begin taking up work as Pullman porters. They take up work for, if you're a woman, you're doing laundry, you're a cook, you're a maid, you're a nanny of sorts. Men are going to become valets. They take city jobs, so to speak. They work in hotels. But of course, during Reconstruction, the dynamic socially between Black and white people was kind of tumultuous at the time, especially for, ironically, a lot of poorer whites who did not even own any slaves prior to emancipation. I think they tended to take emancipation a lot harder because from their perspective, they're seeing it as you're taking jobs away from me. And that's really what's gonna ramp up, I believe, in my opinion, the start of the KKK and its prevalence throughout the Reconstruction period. So even though you do see Black people making tremendous strides, you see the first, I believe, 13 Black men be elected into state legislature during that time period. You see the establishment of Fisk University. You'll later see right after the establishment of Tennessee State University. Roger Williams University comes, I believe, in the 1870s. So you have all of these upheavals of Black success and Black progress happening, but that is happening alongside a lot of social discord as well. So very challenging time post-emancipation in Nashville.
Thank you for that. Dr. Angela Sutton is with us as well, and she is mentioning that so her project, Fort Negley Descendants Project, 4 of those descendants spoke with Fort Negley Descendants Project and recorded that interview as descendants, and that's available in the chat box. You can see her comment if you have any trouble accessing it. That's the Johnsons. If you were to Google Fort Negley Descendants Project, finding that website.
Copying this right now because I want to go see that myself.
Perfect. Wonderful project, and there's other interviews included there. Actually, I think I saw Dr. Eleanor Fleming. She's one of those descendants that was recorded as well. And then we've got one more question that's popped up. Do you have any details about the Belmont plantation, which this is a separate, Belmont separate from Belle Meade, but also a high profile family and house here in Nashville.
Belmont was a summer home, I believe. It was owned by Adelicia Atkin, who was married to Isaac Franklin. Isaac Franklin is notoriously, in my opinion, the biggest slave trader of the antebellum period. And he made what would be the equivalent to millions today from buying and selling slaves. He had a very large plantation in Louisiana known as Angola. Today, that plantation is the Angola Penitentiary or the Louisiana State Penitentiary, one of the most notorious penitentiaries in the American prison system. So if that's not a parallel for you, then I don't know what is. And Adelicia Atkin was pretty much a rich socialite who had a lot of rich husbands. And Belmont was one of the homes that she had during the Civil War. There wasn't a lot that happened at Belmont during the Civil War that I've ever read about. I know that they definitely went to Belmont, but it wasn't like what happened at Carnton. There was no battle on the lawn or anything like that. But socially, it was a summer home, and she went and sat and looked pretty and gave orders to her staff, which probably is not as helpful as you want it to be.
So during the Battle of Nashville, Belmont was used as Union headquarters, largely occupied by Union soldiers. That's right. So I think there's 2 more here, and I think we'll be done with our Q&A. Donald Johnson mentions that his great-grandfather was a brick mason, and should he assume he was a free Black man?
I would honestly say no. It's a possibility. But I wouldn't assume that. I would, if you could do some type of genealogical work and see if there was a plantation nearby, I would assume, if anything, he may have been quasi-independent, but being a free Black, I highly doubt.
Yeah, so Fort Negley, on the labor rolls of people that built Fort Negley, there are many self-emancipated people that are coming from enslavement that were Masons. So I think you're right on it. There's no way you can necessarily jump to that as being the case. Just as much chance of being enslaved as free with that.
Yeah. Fort Negley being there was almost kind of like a beacon of hope of sorts. It gave people who could run away somewhere to go when they did run away. So it probably wasn't the best. We know it wasn't the best living conditions. We know that social issues were still right. But it is the start of what I call Nashville's first Black neighborhood. And then those people are kind of going to spread out over time as emancipation furthers. So Yeah, Fort Negley's played a big role in Black Nashville's development, especially on the earliest scale.
So last one, and you're certainly welcome to read Bill Howell's longer comment here in the chat box, but he's recommending The Ledger and the Chain by Joshua Rothman, speaking to Alicia Ackland's money from her first husband, Isaiah Franklin. And I believe Dr. Lee Williams, when he's speaking on September the 16th, is talking about that slave trade coming from the East Coast through Nashville and down into those areas being established, plantations being established, Louisiana, Mississippi, further west as that land was being opened up. So that's a good comment, and that's a good book to consider as well.
I'm going to check that out for sure.
I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Bridget, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having
wonderful.
me.
We really appreciate having you. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Bridget, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a great night.